Have you ever noticed how a show can kind of sneak up on you emotionally? You're just watching, maybe not even paying much attention to the music, and then suddenly, bam, this like wave of feeling hits you.
Yeah.
I bet you anything, it's probably classical music that's behind it.
Mm.
Even in shows you wouldn't expect.
Yeah.
So that's what we're diving into today. It's how classical music still has this crazy power on TV, even with all the modern scores and, pop songs we hear everywhere these days.
Right.
We're taking a look at a podcast called Classical Crescendo, specifically their episode about the echo of classical music in pop culture.
Okay.
Get ready to rethink everything you thought you knew about, like The Simpsons and even Bridgerton, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing how often classical music is working on us without us even realizing it, you know? It taps into all these deep emotions and memories and ideas we have about culture and stuff.
Right.
And it just shapes how we experience everything without us even knowing.
Okay, so to figure out how we got to, now maybe we need to go back in time a bit.
Sure.
The podcast mentioned that back in the 50s and 60s, orchestras on TV were everywhere.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Back then, TV was almost seen as like this platform for showcasing all the best things about culture. Like even high art, as they called it. You'd have variety shows with like famous singers performing and then a full orchestra playing right after. And public broadcasters, like the BBC, they made sure classical concerts were on TV for everyone to watch.
Wow, that's so different from what we see today.
Yeah.
So what happened? Was it just rock and roll coming along and stealing the show?
Well, that was definitely part of it, but there's more to it than that. TV became, much more about making money. Advertisers wanted shorter segments that were easy to, package up and sell.
Okay.
And pop music with its catchy tunes and, shorter songs fit perfectly.
Right.
So having a full orchestra, which is expensive and complicated, became, less appealing.
So classical music just got pushed aside.
Kind of. It didn't totally disappear. It's more like it evolved.
Yeah.
Think of it this way.
Yeah.
Classical music went from being the main course to being like a really special ingredient, a spice that makes all kinds of dishes taste better.
I like that. Okay, so let's get into some specifics. The podcast mentioned The Simpsons, which is not exactly where I'd expect to find classical music having, a big impact.
It is kind of surprising, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a brilliant example. They use Samuel Barber's Adagio for strings.
Oh, yeah.
Which, if you don't know, is famous for being this really somber, beautiful piece. It's often played at funerals, even. And in The Simpsons, they use it during a scene where a character is experiencing, real grief.
I think I remember that.
And the effect is immediate. It makes the whole moment so much more powerful, even though it's in an animated comedy,
You're right. It's surprisingly moving when I think back on it. But isn't there a risk that using such a well-known piece, like a cliche almost, could kind of backfire?
No.
Could it take viewers out of the moment, instead of making them feel more involved?
That's a good point. Composers have to find that balance between using something familiar but not overusing it to the point where it becomes meaningless.
Right.
But in this case, I think the simplicity of the Adagio and how universal the feelings it expresses are actually work in its favor.
Yeah.
It's like a direct line to a shared emotional language that everyone understands.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Yeah. It's like using a visual shorthand.
Yeah.
Everyone knows what a single tear rolling down someone's cheek means, no matter what's happening.
Right. It's a universal symbol.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that makes classical music so powerful for storytelling.
Yeah.
It can communicate these complex emotions so quickly and directly.
So we have The Simpsons tugging at our heartstrings with Barber. What about a show like Sherlock? That was another one the podcast talked about.
Sherlock's a great example of how you can weave classical music into the score to add depth to the characters and the setting. Even though it's a modern take on Sherlock Holmes, the character and the stories are rooted in, Victorian times. And that period was really influenced by Romantic and Baroque music.
Right.
So by using those styles in the score, it adds this layer of history, like you're hearing echoes of Sherlock's intellectual past, so to speak.
I see. So it's not just about adding some generic classical music for the mood. It's about choosing pieces that add specific meaning to the story.
Exactly. And that leads us to Westworld, which is doing something completely different. It's like this crazy mix of classical arrangements and then modern pop songs, but redone in a classical style.
Yeah, it's like they're playing games with our ears. giving us something familiar, but then making it sound strange at the same time.
Right.
Which I guess is pretty fitting for a show that's all about blurring the lines between what's real and what's artificial.
Exactly. It's like the music itself is questioning what's real and mirroring the whole theme of the show. It's not just background noise. It's actively part of the story.
Okay, so we've got Westworld blending genres. What about shows that use classical music in a more, I don't know, straightforward way?
Well, take The Crown, for instance. They use a lot of Baroque music to underline the grandeur and tradition of the British monarchy. The music isn't just there for ambiance, it's actually woven into the visual look of the show to really drive home those themes of power and legacy.
Oh, that's interesting. So in that case, it's like the music is almost another character in the show. Like it's silently commenting on everything that's happening.
That's a great way to put it. And then, of course, you have shows like Mozart in the Jungle, which is all about the world of orchestral music. It gives you this funny behind-the-scenes look at what it's like to be in an orchestra. And the soundtrack is full of, well, Mozart, of course, but also Mahler and other contemporary composers.
It's like a love letter to orchestral music, showing that it can be the main event, not just something in the background.
Right. And all these examples show how versatile classical music can be. It can be used for building characters, setting the mood, making emotions stronger. It's really a multi-purposed tool for storytellers.
Speaking of characters, let's talk about how this music shapes our understanding of them. I mean, we all know that someone's taste in music can tell you a lot about them.
Absolutely. Take Dr. Fraser Crane, for example, from the sitcom Frasier.
Oh, yeah. I love that show.
His love for opera and classical radio instantly tells us he's sophisticated, intellectual. It's a quick way to communicate his personality without having to rely only on dialogue.
It's like a shortcut for character development. A few bars of Mozart and bam, we get a sense of someone's inner world. But can it really be that simple? I mean, is there a danger of falling into stereotypes here? Like, does listening to classical music automatically make someone smarter?
That's where things get tricky.
Yeah.
You're right, it's a fine line. Composers and the people making the shows have to avoid cliches while still using those powerful associations we have with certain kinds of music. And sometimes playing against those expectations can be even more effective.
Oh, tell me more about that. How do they, play with those stereotypes?
Well, think about how different composers and different styles of music can evoke different emotions. For example, Tchaikovsky is often used to, ramp up the romantic tension in a scene.
Oh, okay, yeah.
While something like Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain, that might signal something darker, more ominous is coming. But what happens when those expectations are flipped?
Flipped. Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Okay, imagine a scene with, brutal violence.
Okay.
But instead of using a harsh, dissonant score, they play a really serene string quartet. The effect is, jarring. It makes the violence even more striking because it's contrasted with something beautiful and peaceful.
Oh, wow. I get it. It's like it messes with your head, but in a good way. You're thinking, wait, am I supposed to be feeling peaceful right now or terrified?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It adds a layer of complexity to what you're watching, and it forces you to think more deeply about it. It's all about playing with those subconscious associations we have with different types of music.
So even when we're just relaxing on the couch, this music is still messing with our minds. But how does it actually do that? What's the science behind it?
Well, for one thing, classical music is incredibly expressive. All the dynamics, the crescendos, the sudden silences, the big changes in volume, they all work together to trigger emotional responses in us.
Okay.
Think about it this way. Our brains are wired to respond to music in a really basic, primal way.
Uh-huh.
Certain sounds and patterns actually trigger the release of hormones like dopamine and oxytocin.
Yeah.
Those are the hormones associated with feeling good and connected.
So when, a really soaring melody gets louder during a romantic scene, it's not just making the scene feel more romantic, it's actually causing a chemical reaction in our brains.
Exactly.
Whoa, that's wild.
And there's more. Even if we don't know the composer or the name of the piece, there's a good chance we've heard that melody before.
Right.
Like in a commercial or a movie, maybe even when we were kids. And that familiarity, even if it's subconscious, creates a connection for us.
It's like a musical shortcut to our emotions. And then there's the whole idea of cultural credibility, too, right? Like, using classical music automatically makes a show seem more, sophisticated.
Fascinating. Think about historical dramas or scenes where they're showing wealth and prestige.
Yeah.
Classical music brings this sense of authenticity and importance that a pop song just wouldn't have. It's like a signal saying, hey, this is serious stuff. Pay attention.
Okay, so we've talked about some of the obvious examples, but the podcast mentioned some hidden gems too. Shows that aren't as well known, but that are doing cool things with classical music.
Oh, yes. Hannibal, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It's a psychological thriller that uses classical music to create this atmosphere of, like, unsettling tension.
Interesting.
It's the contrast between the beauty of the music and the gruesome stuff happening on screen that makes it so effective. It's a really haunting experience.
But isn't there a risk that the beauty of the music could almost, romanticize the violence? Is that always a good thing, or could it be distracting?
You're right to point that out. It's a delicate balance that composers have to get right. But in the case of Hannibal, I think the music is more like a commentary on the duality of beauty and darkness.
Mm-hmm.
It reflects the character's own complicated mind.
I see what you mean. It's like the music is another piece of the psychological puzzle the show is presenting.
Exactly. And then there's Poirot, Agatha Christie's famous detective. The show is set in the 1930s, and they use lots of classical music and period-specific tunes to really make you feel like you're in that era,
Right.
In that world of Art Deco and glamorous parties. It's like a time machine.
Totally. And what about Inspector Morse?
Oh, Inspector Morse. That's a British detective show that cleverly weaves opera into the storyline.
Oh, cool.
Morse himself is a huge opera fan, and you'll often hear snippets of Wagner or Verdi playing in the background. It adds this layer of grandeur to the sometimes quite gritty crime stories.
I'm noticing a pattern here. It seems like a lot of detective shows use classical music to emphasize how smart and cultured the detective is.
You might be onto something. It's definitely a recurring theme. It plays into that idea we were talking about, classical music being a mark of intelligence and refinement.
Right.
Especially in a crime drama.
And before we move on, tell me about that last hidden gem, Downton Abbey.
Downton Abbey is all about tradition and change, set in the early 20th century. And they often play classical piano pieces during dinner parties and social gatherings. It's subtle, but it really highlights the tension between the old world and the modern world that's coming in.
So it's like the music is a Greek chorus, almost, commenting on the characters and what they're going through.
That's a great way to think about it. It shows how music can be more than just background noise. It can be a key part of telling the story.
Okay, so we've talked about drama, we've talked about mystery. But can classical music be funny?
Of course it can. Comedy often relies on the unexpected. And using classical music in a funny way can be hilarious.
Like in Mr. Bean.
Exactly. Mr. Bean is a perfect example. They use these playful, whimsical classical melodies to go along with Rowan Atkinson's, silly antics.
Yeah.
And the contrast between the formal music and the absurdity of what he's doing, it's just hilarious.
It's like the music is in on the joke, right?
Right.
We know this is ridiculous, but let's make it even funnier with a little Beethoven.
Exactly. And then you have shows like Family Guy, which love pop culture references. They'll sometimes use a classical piece straight for comedic timing, or even parody something famous, like the William Tell Overture, for a quick laugh.
And let's not forget Monty Python's Flying Circus, the kings of absurdity. They were masters of using classical music in completely unexpected ways.
Oh, absolutely. Monty Python often used classical music ironically. Imagine a really highbrow orchestral piece playing during a sketch about a silly walk or a dead parrot. The clash between what you're seeing and what you're hearing is what makes it so funny.
It's like they're making fun of those stuffy classical music conventions and making us laugh at the same time.
Precisely. It shows just how flexible classical music can be and how it can be adapted and reinterpreted in endless ways.
Speaking of reinterpreting classical music, we have to talk about Bridgerton. That show took the internet by storm with its modern take on classical music.
Bridgerton is such an interesting case study. They took modern pop songs by artists like Ariana Grande and Taylor Swift and arranged them for string quartets and other classical ensembles. So you have these familiar pop melodies, but they're played with classical instruments in a style that makes you think of like a ballroom from centuries ago.
It's this cool mix of old and new, and it makes classical music feel fresh and exciting, especially for younger audiences.
Exactly. It shows that those classical instruments still have power, and the music itself is timeless. Even when it's reimagined for a modern audience, it keeps that elegance and sophistication.
It's proof that classical music can evolve and change with the times without losing what makes it special.
Right. And it makes you wonder, what does the future hold for classical music on TV?
That's a great question. Especially now with all the streaming services and global audiences, it feels like there are so many possibilities.
Absolutely. We're on the verge of some really exciting changes in the ways music is used and experienced.
And who knows what those changes will bring.
Exactly.
Well, I'm definitely excited to find out. But for now, we're going to take a quick break. Join us for part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll explore even more fascinating examples and dig even deeper into the psychological impact of classical music on our TV viewing experience.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on this fascinating journey exploring how classical music shapes our TV experience. And I'm telling you, I'm looking at shows I thought I knew in a whole new light.
It's remarkable, isn't it, how this music, which some might consider old, is not only sticking around but thriving in this world that's constantly bombarded with new sounds and trends. It really speaks to something deep within us, don't you think? Absolutely. It's like we're uncovering this hidden code, this secret layer of meaning in our favorite shows. We talked last time about the emotional impact of classical music, but I'm curious to go deeper into that. You mentioned the science behind those expressive dynamics, the crescendos, the sudden silences, all that trigger our emotions. How does that actually work?
Well, think of it this way. Our brains are hardwired to respond to music in a very primal way. Certain sounds, certain patterns actually trigger the release of hormones like dopamine and oxytocin. Now, those are the feel-good chemicals, the ones associated with pleasure and connection.
So you're saying when we hear like a soaring melody swell during a romantic scene, it's not just setting the mood, it's actually causing a physical reaction in our bodies. That's incredible.
It is. It's like the music is giving our emotions a little boost, helping us connect more deeply with what we're seeing on screen.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's not just about the emotional impact, right?
Huh.
You also mentioned that classical music can affect how we perceive time. Now, that one I don't quite get. How can music affect our sense of time?
It's subtle, but it's a powerful effect. Think about the difference in tempo and rhythm between classical music and, say, modern pop music. Classical pieces often have a slower, more deliberate pace.
Okay, yeah.
And that can create a sense of expansiveness, of timelessness.
So it's like the music is actually slowing down our internal clock, making us feel more present in the moment.
Exactly. And this can be especially effective in historical dramas or fantasy shows, where the creators want to transport us to a different time period or even a different world altogether.
I'm thinking about those beautiful sweeping scenes in The Crown now, and it totally makes sense. The music gives you space to really feel the weight of history.
That's a perfect example. And that brings us to the use of classical music in science fiction and fantasy. We talked about Westworld earlier, but there's so many other great examples out there.
Oh, definitely. Like Battlestar Galactica, for instance. I remember them using a lot of opera, which seems kind of out of place for a show that's so action-packed and intense. How does that work?
It might seem like an odd pairing at first, but they used opera brilliantly to create this sense of epic scale and grandeur. Remember, Battlestar Galactica is about humanity's struggle for survival against these incredibly powerful beings, the Cylons.
Right, the robots with a god complex.
Exactly. And the music elevates the stakes, making us feel the weight of the characters' decisions and the epic scope of their fight for survival.
It's like the music is saying, this isn't just about spaceships and lasers, folks. This is about the fate of humanity.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And another show that uses classical music effectively, though in a very different way, is Doctor Who. It's a show that's been around for decades, exploring countless worlds and time periods.
Yeah, and they've had some incredible soundtracks over the years. Are you saying they use classical music too? I always thought of the music as more electronic and experimental.
They definitely draw from a wide range of styles, but there's a strong classical influence, particularly in the use of leitmotifs.
Leitmotifs. Remind me what that is again.
A leitmotif is a recurring musical theme that's specifically associated with a particular character, place, or idea. It's like a musical shorthand. When you hear that theme, you instantly know who or what it represents.
Oh, right, like Darth Vader's theme in Star Wars.
Exactly. Doctor Who uses leitmotifs brilliantly to connect different episodes and storylines, creating a sense of continuity across the vast expanse of the show's universe.
It's like the music is weaving this tapestry that holds the whole sprawling narrative together.
That's a beautiful analogy. It really highlights how music can create cohesion and meaning, even in the most complex and imaginative stories.
So after hearing all these different examples, I'm really struck by how classical music isn't just this relic of the past. It's a living, breathing art form that still speaks to creators in so many ways.
I completely agree. And its presence on TV is a testament to its enduring power and its ability to connect with audiences on this deep emotional level.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we start talking about the future of classical music on TV, I'm curious, what are your favorite examples? The ones that have really stuck with you?
That's a tough one. There are so many great examples to choose from, but one that immediately comes to mind is the use of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata in the film A Clockwork Orange.
Oh, that's a great one. It's such a haunting and beautiful piece, but the way it's used in that film is so disturbing. What do you think makes it work so well?
It's the contrast. You have this incredibly beautiful and moving piece of music juxtaposed with scenes of shocking violence. It creates this jarring dissonance that really forces the viewer to confront the complex relationship between art and violence.
It's like the music is asking, can something be beautiful and terrible at the same time?
Precisely. It's a reminder that classical music can be used to explore difficult and challenging themes, not just to evoke feelings of beauty and grandeur.
You know, I've never thought about it that way before, but you're right, it adds this whole other layer to the experience. Do you have another example you could share?
Another one that I find fascinating is the use of Mozart's Requiem in the TV series Lost. It's a piece that's traditionally associated with death and mourning. But in the context of that show, it takes on this whole other meaning.
I've heard so much about Lost, but I've never actually seen it. How does the Requiem work in that show?
Well, without giving too much away, the show deals with themes of fate, redemption, and the afterlife.
Okay.
And the Requiem underscores those themes, adding layers of mystery and a sense of impending doom.
So it sounds like the music isn't just setting the mood, it's actively encouraging viewers to think about these big existential questions.
Exactly. And that's what I find so exciting about the use of classical music on TV. It can elevate a story, make us think in new ways, and even challenge our perceptions of the world around us.
It's like a secret language whispering beneath the surface of the story.
I love that. It's an invitation to listen more closely, to pay attention not just to what we're seeing, but to what we're feeling.
You know, after this conversation, I'm realizing that watching TV might be a lot more complex than I ever gave it credit for.
I agree. It's not just about passive entertainment. It's about engaging with stories, characters, and ideas on multiple levels. And music plays a key role in shaping that experience.
I think most people, myself included, take the music for granted. It's just there in the background. But you're making me realize how much it's actually doing.
It's easy to overlook, especially in this age of constant stimulation. But music has this incredible power to speak to us on a deeper level, even when we're not consciously aware of it.
So even when we're just vegging out on the couch, the music is still working its magic.
Exactly. And the more we understand how it works, the more we can appreciate its subtle power.
Well, that wraps up part 2 of our deep dive into the world of classical music on TV. Next time, we'll shift our focus to the future and explore what might be in store for this timeless art form in a world of streaming services, global audiences, and seemingly endless possibilities for musical innovation. Don't miss it. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've spent the last 2 parts exploring how classical music shapes our TV experience. From the emotional punch of The Simpsons using Barber's Adagio to the grandeur of The Crown with all its, time-bending stuff.
And it's amazing how varied it is. I mean, we've talked about opera and space battles to Mozart jokes and Family Guy.
It's true.
It makes you wonder what's next for this old music in our modern TV world, right?
That's what I'm excited to talk about. With streaming, global audiences, new technology, it feels like the possibilities are kind of exploding.
They are. And one of the biggest things I think we'll see is even more blurring of the lines between different types of music. We talked about Bridgerton doing those pop covers in a classical style.
Yeah.
But imagine taking that further. Shows that blend classical instruments with, say, electronic beats, world music rhythms, even those experimental soundscapes you hear these days.
Oh, wow. Like a soaring orchestral piece with a driving techno beat underneath. Or a Mozart symphony with like a sitar solo weaving in and out.
Exactly. It's about pushing boundaries, creating something totally new, while still respecting the traditions and skill of classical music.
I love that.
And as more composers from all over the world gain recognition, I think we'll hear a much wider range of influences making their way into TV scores.
It's like a global musical melting pot, all coming together on our screens.
Right.
But it's not just the music itself that's changing, is it? Technology has to play a role, too.
Absolutely. Think about the possibilities of interactive media, for example.
Ooh, yeah.
Imagine a show where you, the viewer, can choose between different soundtracks depending on your mood, or even control the tempo or instrumentation in real time.
Whoa. That's next level stuff. It'd be like having your own personal conductor, shaping the music to how you feel at that moment. Kind of like those choose your own adventure books, but with music.
Exactly. And as virtual reality and augmented reality become more common, who knows how classical music might become part of those immersive worlds.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine attending a virtual concert right from your living room, or even stepping inside a symphony orchestra with the music all around you.
It really makes you think. It's not just about watching a show anymore. It's about experiencing it with all your senses. And music could be such a huge part of that.
Definitely. And don't forget about the educational possibilities. You could have interactive soundtracks that give you insights into the music itself, explaining different composers, instrument styles, all while you're enjoying the show.
So it's like learning without even realizing it. You're being entertained and educated at the same time.
Exactly. It's all about making classical music more accessible, more engaging, more relevant for new generations.
It all comes back to what we've talked about throughout this deep dive, doesn't it? It's not just about preserving old music. It's about using it to create something new and exciting.
I couldn't agree more. It's about taking those timeless melodies and reimagining them for today's world, finding new ways to tell stories, make us feel things, and connect with each other through music.
You know, I started this episode thinking, okay, classical music on TV, how interesting can it be? But it's honestly changed how I think about music and television.
I'm so glad to hear that. It's been great exploring these ideas with you.
It really has. But before we wrap things up, I have one final question for you and for everyone listening out there.
Oh, yeah.
Think about all the examples we've talked about and all the possibilities we've imagined. What's your favorite way to experience classical music on TV? Is it those big, epic scores and sci-fi shows, the haunting melodies and thrillers, or maybe how comedies use it to make you laugh? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
That's a great question to leave everyone with. There's so much out there to discover and enjoy.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think that's a wrap for our deep dive into the fascinating world of classical music on TV. A huge thank you to you for joining us and sharing your insights.
It's been my pleasure. Keep listening, keep exploring, and let the music be your guide.
And that's all for the deep dive. Until next time, keep those ears open and stay curious.